It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Phil O'Brien. Phil's an American historian. We're not going to hold that against him after that last session there. So you don't have to apologise for everything today, Phil. And he's a Professor of Strategic Studies at the University of St Andrews and formerly at the University of Glasgow, where he ran the Scottish Centre for War Studies. And he was, amongst other things, he was attended Pembroke College, University of Cambridge.
By looking at what we were asked to do for this talk, it seemed to me really we could boil it down to three questions. And the three questions we've been asked to address are, one, what is the future of the US-European relationship? We know where we are now, but where are we going? And what do we think it will look like in the future? Then in particular, how does this future impact on the UK? How does the United Kingdom position itself in this new world that is coming out in US-European relations? And finally, in particular, when it comes to the UK, how does it bring about that relationship with a new relationship with Europe, or a new interaction with Europe? So that's the way, at least, I read the three questions we were asked to address, and I'm going to take them in that order. And the first one I will talk about in probably the most detail, because it's the one I think I know the most about, and that is, what will the future be for the EU and the US? And I'm going to start this with two basic premises, which I think will inform the framework going forward. We are not going back. I think that has to be accepted. When people talk about returning to normality or going back to sort of a strong NATO, I think that era is over. And by the way, that's okay. Eras come and go. So the period of US-European relations that started, pick your choice, 1941, 1945, or maybe 1948, that has ended. And it's not, what we see in the future is not going to be that. The second thing is that actually that's not a bad thing either. Not a bad thing for the United States, and not a bad thing for Europe. I think the old relationship, what we talk about as normality, had actually become very unhealthy for both parties. So when we look to the future, hopefully we can construct, or something new will be constructed, that will actually be healthier for both, and I think change the balance, change the basic interrelationships between the United States and the European Union. Why are we not going back? Well, one of the problems is too much of the focus has been on Trump. Trump did not change everything overnight. He is an accelerant of a change that was undergoing. All right, so he is sort of a massive accelerant. I don't think we would have gone through the kinds of stages of grief that we have seen in the last 15 months so quickly without Trump. But what Trump was doing was in many ways pushing along a change within the United States that began in 1991, say, when the Soviet Union broke up, or you could say began in 2001 in the War on Terror, or even 2022 with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And that is the decline of an Atlanticist interest in US domestic politics. That US-European relations in the 20th century were arguably, or certainly until 1991, were the key relationship for the USA. What happened in Europe was seen to be vitally important to the United States. Economically, in many ways socially, Americans, if they went overseas, went to Europe. And it was seen as, what happened in Europe was seen to really, really matter. For both parties, that kind of interest began to wane. It began to wane over the previous decades. Trump, though, as I said, pushed it on. Why are we not going to go back? Well, we've got two parties in the United States, and it's unlikely we're going to have a third. Maybe there will be a third pop up in the next 20 years, but everyone talks about a third party in the United States, it never appears for any period of time. So we're probably stuck with the Republicans and the Democrats for the foreseeable future. Both of them are now moving away from Atlanticism, one at rocket speed, the Republicans, but the Democrats, you might say, at a fast walk. And that's not going to change. What are the Republicans now? By the way, this is one of the things, we use phrases like the Republicans and the Democrats as if they are things that don't change. The Republican Party now is basically the Democratic Party of 1900. And I won't go into that in detail unless you're really nerdy. But basically, if you voted Democrat in 1900, you were small-town, Midwestern, Southern, poor. You were evangelical Christian. You are now a Republican. So what we know of as the Republican Party is actually the Democratic Party of 1900, and vice versa. If you were a Republican in 1900, you're almost certainly a suburban voter in the Northeast, Midwest. You're almost certainly now a Democratic Party. And that change happened beginning only about 30, 40 years ago, really. But what Trump did is he understood what the Republican Party's base was. The Republican Party's base is small town, Midwestern, Southern, white voters. And that these voters have no interest in Atlanticism. It plays no role in their thought, no role in their interest. And he, because he himself had no interest in Atlanticism beyond wanting to have a friendly relationship with Russia, that's his version of Atlanticism, was able to destroy all what we thought were the norms of the Republican Party. We thought the Republican Party was a pro-NATO party, but that was based on a Republican Party that actually died 30 or 40 years ago. And Trump, and I pay him credit as a political manipulator, do never underestimate Donald Trump as a politician. He's one of the most extraordinary politicians in US history. He understood that instinctively, whereas most Republicans didn't want to admit it. He understood the party didn't care about her. And so he could go and blow up the whole thing. And now the Republican Party's base is a Trumpite base. That is it. So that party is not going to change because that's who its voters are. And so it's not going to be taken back. Even if Marco Rubio is the nominee in 2028, it's not going to somehow revert to what we would think of as traditional republicanism. It is Donald Trump's party, Donald Trump's base. And if J.D. Vance is the nominee, it'll even become probably more extreme anti-Atlanticist. So the Republican Party is what the Republican Party is. But the Democratic Party also had changed. So the Democratic Party, I mean, in many ways, Joe Biden really papered over a change in the Democratic Party that had been going on for a while. Biden was a relic of the Cold War. Biden was a 1970s, 80s American politician. That's where he rose to prominence and cut his teeth. His original foreign policy interventions were Cold War foreign policy interventions, when he really took a very strongly Atlanticist position. When he got to the presidency, he was a very old person, in many ways living with those older ideas. The Democratic Party today does not have those kind of Joe Biden ideals or visions within it. It's not hostile to NATO or hostile to Atlanticism in the way that you would say many elements of the Republican Party is, but it just doesn't really care a lot. You're not going to get them standing up and saying, we care a great deal about reforming NATO and having Americans fight for NATO and reinforcing the nuclear shield over Europe. That's not any major, Democrats are not talking about that in the United States. If you look at the Democratic wings, I'd say there are actually two bases in the Democratic Party. In the Republican Party, there's one base, it's at the Trumpite base, and that rules. The Democratic Party has two bases that are sort of dueling right now for control, but neither of them are strongly Atlanticist. One, you might say, is quite Atlanticist skeptical. That's the part I'll call the Bernie Sanders AOC wing, which might be the most passionate wing in the Democratic Party. That part, I mean, Sanders is an AOC, that's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the representative from Queens, who is the rising star in the Democratic Party. They would come from the wing of the Democratic Party that would have been considered the most anti-Atlanticist of any element in the US polity before Trump. So that's that part of it. But even what we would say is the more centrist wing of the Democratic Party, Gavin Newsom, Andy Beshear, people like that, Pete Buttigieg, their Atlanticism is there. I mean, they'll talk about NATO, and they certainly wouldn't want to leave NATO, but it's not a major issue for them. So that's what I mean. Maybe you will get a Democrat Atlanticist elected president in 2028. That's still, that's still a long shot, but it's a possibility you'll get a Democrat Atlanticist in 2028. But that could be just another 4 years, and you're back to a Trump-like Republican. There will be no stability in U.S. politics in favor of the old way. So I think that's what when I talk about we're not going back, I think it's because the United States is not going to go back to 70 years of commitment to European security. That's the difference. That commitment to European security, which began in 1941, ended, and whatever comes afterwards, there will be less commitment, because there will not be the political underpinnings of that commitment. So that's one element about we're not going back. The second one is that actually I don't think it would be a good thing to go back anyway. I think the transatlantic relationship had become deeply unhealthy for both Americans and Europeans. And it really came out in the last 16 months about how unhealthy the relationship had become. And in many ways, it was worse for Europe than Europeans wanted to admit. And I'll start with a little story. And this was almost 2 years ago. Edward Stringer and I, Ed is a former RAF Air Marshal who now does a lot of good great defense policy work. We were writing an article for Foreign Affairs, which came out in September 2024, which we thought was pretty non-controversial. The article was, Europe has to get ready for Trump. All right, we weren't geniuses. There were two candidates. There's a two-horse race, 50-50 chance that Trump was going to get elected. And so the article was, Europe needed to start preparing for a Trump presidency, because there looked to be, in August, September of 2024, a pretty good chance that Trump was going to be president. And we said, again, this was not controversial in our mind in any way. Well, Trump has been openly anti-NATO. He's been openly anti-Atlanticist. He has talked about not fighting for Europe, and he wants a good relationship for Putin. All of this was on the record. It was completely non-controversial. Therefore, the European states might be left in a situation where they will have to look after themselves, where they cannot count on the U.S. And we came up with four very basic steps that European states should consider. None of these were considered controversial. Like, maybe you should consider military logistics. Can you actually move forces? I mean, pretty basic stuff. And when the article came out, it was fascinating, as we received a lot of quite hostile feedback, always privately, from, all I'll say is people with significant policy histories and chops saying, you cannot say this. Why can't we say it? Well, on the one hand, it's fascinating contradictory emotions. One, you can't say it because it'll never happen. America will never choose Trump. We'll just think good thoughts. And the second one was, you can't say it because even if they choose Trump, there's nothing we can do. Europeans were so far deep down the rabbit hole that even if asked to look after themselves, they wouldn't be able to do it, was the argument. So don't kick the hornet's nest. Just let's think good thoughts and hope it works out. And this was 2 months before the election, was the reaction we got. And I remember talking with Ed, because I think I got surprised by the reaction. What we came to is actually Europeans, and by the way, I know my East Fife accent isn't that strong, but I've lived in Scotland for 30 years, and I'm a UK citizen now as well as you, so I feel I am European. My son is German and British, so I feel I can use the we about Europe too. What was fascinating about the European mindset, I think, was Europeans had lost the ability to think for themselves. They had no strategic understanding, an ability to think about European issues without the United States. They had, in some ways, outsourced all their strategic thinking for so long to the United States that even the prospect of thinking about their own security was so terrible. That was too much. In many ways, it was like, trying to come up with bad analogies, it was like a muscle that had atrophied. European strategic thinking was an atrophied muscle. No one had done it for such a long time in the strategic, in the military sphere. They'd done it in the economic soft power sphere. They'd not done it in the military strategic sphere, that when asked, presented with the possibility of having to do it, they couldn't do it. And that is why we witnessed what I would say was the calamity of 2025. The calamity of 2025 was, and Trump took huge advantage of that, was because the panic that European states felt when asked to look after themselves. When Trump started doing nothing that was a surprise, everything that Trump did in 2025, he telegraphed for years ahead of time. He was going to abandon Ukraine. He was going to try and get close to Putin. He was thinking about the Western Hemisphere. He had eyes on Greenland. He wanted Canada as the 51st state. He was going to go for tariffs. None of that was new. The only shock was people were surprised by Trump doing exactly what he said he was going to do. And yet what happened is the European response, I would say, was pathetic. And it was pathetic because European leaders did not want to take responsibility for their own future. They really thought if we compliment him enough, we'll get through the next 4 years, hopefully get an Atlantis as president, and then of course I'll be out of power at that time and it'll be someone else's problem. And I think that was governing a lot of the European leadership. So there was this courting of Trump, this backslapping of Trump, this praising of Trump, unctuous praising of Trump, acting like good schoolboys, which, by the way, made it worse because Trump just despises European leaders. If you think any of this praise did you any good, you must be disabused of this. It made things worse. So the shocking thing is that people were shocked by Greenland in January 2026. Greenland in January 2026 was the natural culmination of where the United States has been heading throughout all of 2025. It was only a shock because people willfully were ignoring the reality that we were facing. Right? That was what was going on. And so when it comes to Europe going forward, this has to change. I mean, this was not healthy, as I said. The European inability to think for itself had led Europe into a potentially calamitous situation, where literally there were French and German troops being rushed to Greenland in January. Right? Last minute rushing of troops to Greenland because they didn't want to admit the world that they were in until they had to, with the threat of an American gun, to do it. So that is why not only are we not going back, it would be a terrible thing to go back for Europe. Europe, I think, actually needs to start thinking and acting for itself. Will it? Now this becomes the question. And this is where I think we have to distinguish between words and deeds. There has been, up until January of 2026, I would argue, almost all words in the idea of Europeans acting in their own interests. There had been some elements. German defense spending went up. I mean, Germany has played a very interesting role. Polish defense spending had risen. The Poles were building up defenses. The Finns always were ready to defend themselves. So there had been elements of European thinking about how we actually defend ourselves without the United States. But on the whole, very little had changed. Defense spending was going to go up, but it was going to go up 5-10 years from now. It wasn't actually going up then. So most of the changes were rhetorical. Right? In 2026, it is better, I would argue. But I don't think it actually is quite the substantial, permanent change that we sometimes have people acting as if they are seeing. In other words, things are different. I think Europeans standing up for Ukraine is absolutely important. Understanding that the US is not only out of the game with Ukraine, but actually wants to have a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. and not pretending anymore that the United States is going to do anything for Ukraine. That is important, and that if Ukraine is going to be supported, it's going to come from Europe, and that is tangible support, which, by the way, was, without the Hungarian election result, was still a bit in play. So we're talking 2 months ago, it was not quite clear what European support was going to go to Ukraine. So that is a good, tangible change. But actually, for most states, the changes are minimal. British defense spending is going down this year. Yes, it might go up in 5 to 10 years' time. But most European states, except those on the front line with Russia, are actually not doing that much to improve their, what I would call, strategic autonomy, European strategic autonomy. So if, before I say that there will be a permanent change, I think you're going to have to see more. I think the direction of travel in 2026 is much better than 2025, because in 2026 Europeans aren't lying to themselves anymore. 2025 is a year of deception, self-deception. But now, once you tell the truth to yourself, what you have to start doing is acting on the truth. I still think there's a ways to go on the actions. So that's sort of where we are going. The United States is going to be unreliable. Europe, going forward, European states will have to say, either do they want to have strategic autonomy and look after themselves or not. All right? Better signs than before, but I would say that that question is not fully answered. Now, what about the UK? And the UK, one of the questions you had to look to both the EU and the USA are almost to choose. Well, this is where actually Natalie stole my whole entire damn line. Geography is geography. And what we have learned in the last few years is that there is no separate UK security from the rest of Europe. And if any, and I'm going to leave it to David to talk about the economic stuff, so I'm not going to get into the economics of it, but I also think the case for economic relationships is as strong as it is for security relationships. But in fact, when we look at UK security, there is no UK security outside of a general European security. In fact, probably the need for a whole European security order has grown as we have seen changes in military technology and indeed degradations in restraints on how weapons are used. What we have seen in the last few years is the growth of long-range weapon strikes and the decline in restraint in how they're used. I mean, right now, it's still shocking. I'm still amazed how people seem to tolerate the fact that a European state is having most of its major cities attacked every day or every week. All right, and everyone seems to be going about their lives. And that's what we are now. We actually accept the bombardment of European cities as now a normal condition. All right? And that's the future. And in that case, there is no separate UK security. The UK isn't that far from Russia when it comes to these cheap mass systems. They can be manufactured. Russia's making 30,000 Shaheeds a month now. All right? UK couldn't intercept 200 a night. Right? So the idea that there is a separate UK security going forward is nonsense. And I think that, by the way, says the future is the UK can't defend itself on itself. It has to be part of a European security order. And if it's going to be part of a European security order, it's probably going to have to be part of a European economic order, or a larger kind of European political structure. And the United States, it cannot be trusted to defend Europe. And it cannot, therefore, be trusted to defend the UK. I mean, the most frustrating thing of the last year to me has actually been the desperate attempt by British policymakers to pretend the world hadn't changed. The British were, in some ways, the least willing to accept this new world. I went to constant events in London, foreign policy events with senior civil servants and policymakers, and I would always hear, don't give up on the US. It's all going to be okay. We'll move on after Trump. We need to have a close relationship with the USA. What they didn't realize is the UK has no control over this. The UK was thinking it was an actor The UK is not an actor. It is a supplicant when it comes to the United States. It will never be an actor. And it didn't want to accept that. It wanted to live in the fiction that the UK mattered. Well, it doesn't matter to the United States at all. It actually does matter to Europeans. That's been the fascinating thing, is that over the last year, the people most frustrated with the British were other Europeans. Now again, I don't want to get too much into the structure of defense, but there's something called the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which was set up originally by NATO countries to bring together Northern European states, the Baltics, the Nordics, Poland, and the UK was to play the lead in the JEF as sort of the planning, coordinating nation going forward. Now, those states wanted Britain to be a leader in the JEF. And for the last year, they've been sort of pleading with the British to play a leading role in the JEF, but it was the British who were holding them at length, because they didn't want to offend the United States. The British role was actually to lose an opportunity to be a strategic leader in Northern Europe because of fear of offending Donald Trump, who doesn't like... The thing about Trump is he BS's on NATO all the time. He loves NATO because he can control European states. He doesn't love NATO because he's fight for it. He'll never fight for you. But he'll never give NATO up, because as long as he has NATO, you have to do what he says. All right? And that was one of the great examples of that with the JEF, is that the British were afraid to activate the JEF and play a leading role because they thought it might offend Trump, and it probably would. All right? So it was I think this was the example of the problem. The other one, by the way, where the British totally shot themselves in the foot from the desire to please the United States isn't European, it's Canada. If you were talking with Canadian policymakers in 2025, they were stunned by the lack of support the British government gave them. Yeah, I know King Charles gave a speech, but don't overread that. Okay? What they wanted was signs from the British government so the British government would stand up to Trump when Trump called Canada the 51st state, and they really didn't get it. And don't think that wasn't noticed in Canada. Okay, it really was. So all I would say is in security terms, the United States isn't that interested in British security. Europe is vitally interested. Now, maybe this will get to the last point. What will Britain do? In many ways, you tell me. Because British politics, when it comes to security and its future, seems entirely screwed up. And I will say, it's been fascinating to see how different political systems have been put under stress tests in the last few years, and how some have reacted well and some have reacted badly. And the United States system, I think, reacted terribly badly when put under certain stress tests. I think the British system has behaved pretty poorly as well. That we have a situation where the overwhelming number of British people oppose Brexit, believe it was a mistake, want closer relationships with Europe, and yet that is not what the political system is creating in elections such as the ones we saw yesterday. Britain will do what its politics tell it to do. If we are going to have a reform government in a few years, no, you are not going to actually play a productive role. Reform is pretty much the Republican Party of the United States in a different guise. So what the UK does in its future will be determined by the political situation that we see in Britain in the next election. So it's really up to you. I'm not going to say it's automatically going to work out, because I'm not sure it is. Things are better than they were before, but we're certainly not there.
We did hear Trump, but maybe the mistake that we made was that we trusted in the separation of powers in the US probably more than... We all knew what Trump was going to do. We just expected perhaps Congress, the Supreme Court, would stand up to him, would temper his more extreme elements. Do you think it's fair to say?
No, because the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. So I think the separation of powers is based on the fact that different parties or groups can actually take control of different levers of government. But what we had was a situation where one party controlled all of it. And then that one party with a very, this is where I hate underrating Trump, don't underrate him, with one of the best political manipulators in US history was sitting at the top, and who had been empowered there are certain things, he was re-elected after January 6th, 2021. And once you get re-elected after trying to overthrow the US government, I think you're not going to be terribly restrained. So, I mean, the foolishness was the European thought that somehow it might be okay. But that was because, I think, of the fear, as I said. It wasn't that, I think all this argument about, oh, separation of powers will save us, was simply another way of saying, we can't face reality, so I'm going to come up with lots of great reasons why I don't have to face reality.
Hi there. All hegemonic powers go into decline eventually. America has over-indebted itself, probably can't afford its military power anymore. What signalled the end of the British Empire was a group of Irish rebels who called the bluff of the British Empire, and ultimately the Irish Free State was created. And I wonder whether Iran is fulfilling the same role as the Irish rebels, calling the bluff of the American Empire, and we're actually beginning to see American decline. And the observation I would make from this side of the Atlantic is there's a hell of a lot of Americans in denial as well.
The US in decline is one that's fascinating, that argument, because it really is sort of a which way you want to look at the question. I mean, there has been undeniable US decline from, say, 1990, 1991. 1990, 1991, the United States was 30 to 40%, 30% of the world economy, had a military that was absolutely unchallenged. And by the way, in 1945, it was half the world's economy. So the United States has been in a steady economic decline in many ways over the past 80 years. I mean, now it's 20-odd% of the world economy. And a lot of the growth is coming from the global south, particularly Asia, East Asia and South Asia. And the United States' economic advantage is not going to be what it was. But it still is, by the way, probably the most technologically advanced. It's not like Britain went into decline. The United States passed it economically in 1895 or 1890 or something like that. Whereas now, actually, if you compare it to Europe, the United States is still growing a bit more quickly than Europe. I mean, Europe's got a big problem in economic growth. So I'm not quite sure the US is going to go into the kind of rapid economic decline that some people think. When it comes to military power, I think what you said, the United States military is an extraordinary machine, but with real limitation. It's basically set up to win any battle it fights. All right, so if I'm going to ever want to attack you, I'm going to probably blow up your house. All right, and I'll be able to raise the American flag on your house and celebrate. But what it can't do is really do much. What does it do beyond that? And that's where it struggles. I mean, it struggled in the War on Terror for 20 years, being able to do, other than blowing up houses, what does it actually achieve? And that is the limitations we're seeing in Iran. And in many ways, the Iran issue also illuminated a problem that had been hidden for a long time, which is the United States is armed what we'll call in breadth but not depth. There's very little stockpiles there. I mean, the United States blew through huge numbers of stockpiles of weapons in weeks fighting Iran, to the degree, I mean, I wrote a piece about this in the Atlantic, and the United States can't fight China now. There's all this talk, the United States and China might go to war. No, the United States cannot fight China. It simply doesn't have the stockpiles of things to fight China. So that kind of limitations. On the other hand, by the way, China is not going to invade North America either. So you have that, I would say, America isn't in decline. It's certainly not what it was, but it could be dominant in the Western Hemisphere if it wishes to militarily.
Thank you, Phillips. This has been really interesting. Mine as well. You've made a frankly bracing assessment of British politics. Is the trouble to do with the current political personalities and complexion, or is there something deeper in the United Kingdom that is preventing this turn to Europe in terms of strategic autonomy?
The British political system works if you have two dominant parties going back and forth. Labour and Conservatives. First it was the Liberals and the Conservatives, and then Liberals go and Labour comes up, and you end up with two parties. Now, if you have two parties back and forth, then and they're going to be dominant, then the British system at least provides some kind of stability. The problem is now people do not have party identifications. I mean, there are what, 5 or 6 parties? How many parties got more than 15% of the vote now? 5 in Scotland? It was 5. And in the UK, it was it 4 or 5, I think, in England. So it's an extraordinary number of parties that are getting these votes. And the British system cannot handle that. I actually don't think it's functional under that, if that's the way British people are going to vote, because then you can have a situation where reform does get 25% of the votes, but actually gets a majority in the House of Commons. So it's a systemic issue at this point.
Northern Eastern Corridor can it save Europe and transatlantic bond?
Well, can it save Europe? I mean, by the way, I don't think it's a catastrophe at all if the US leaves NATO. In many ways, I prefer it. I think Europe would be better. By the way, I don't know if people are noticing what's been happening in the Russia-Ukraine war in the last 3 to 6 months. Ukraine's taking the war to Russia. Europe can look after itself. I mean, Ukraine now, without any aid from the United States that is material, is transforming the war. You know, it's taking the war to Russia. The idea that Europe cannot look after itself is bonkers. It's only because of the muscle atrophy. My worry for Europe is that Europe divides. I mean, if Europe holds together, its future will be fine. Because it has the economic power, it has the technological power, it has the people, it has the educated population to look after itself, you know, to produce. The worry is that Europe splits. Now, I would prefer, actually, if in many ways Europeans deferred to the North and the East. You know, I would love if European defense policy were run by a Finn. But I mean, if you have the Nordics, the Baltics, the Poles, Germans, all coming together in a defense structure, which would, by the way, integrate the British really well, happily integrate the British, that would probably be the driver. The problem would be if you actually have political splits. I mean, I know people celebrated about Orban losing, but let's see the French election next year. All right? I mean, this is not over. Populism is not over in Europe. We could have a Le Penist, you know, in charge of France in only a few months' time. So Europe could still split going on that. And in that case, that Northeast corridor becomes vital.
Where does this leave the UK as a nuclear power?
I mean, in terms of nuclear weapons. Well, this is one of the fascinating things that no one, they're starting to talk about now. Look, there's going to have to be a European deterrent, or there's going to be about 5 or 6 separate nuclear deterrents in Europe. One thing that has come out, that we have let the cat out of the bag in the Ukraine war in the way that we deferred to Russia. We have made it very clear, if you have nuclear weapons, you're going to be treated differently. All right, the reason we were told Ukraine can't be helped in certain ways is because Russia has nuclear weapons. So we have said, if you are a nuclear power, you get deferred to. By the way, that's also the way Israel's been treated. So you are making it very clear, if Europeans are going to look after themselves in the future, there's going to have to be a European nuclear deterrent. Now, either that can be done jointly in a structure, which does not exist. That is the problem now. And by the way, if it's just a French and British nuclear deterrent, the French and the British would love this to continue and offer it to the Eastern Europeans. The Eastern Europeans don't believe this for a moment. You know, they don't think they can trust the British Prime Minister, Nigel Farage, to defend them in case of a Russian threat. So the British deterrent in and of itself is pretty meaningless. So either what will happen is that you will have some kind of European structure, probably a European NATO, that will have a nuclear deterrent within it, which could be developed and manned by the French and the British, but with a command structure that assures Europe, or you will have lots of European states developing their own nuclear weapons. The Poles, for instance, might say, we're on the border with Belarus, we need our own nukes. I would be very surprised if the Ukrainians, to protect themselves going forward, do not develop a nuclear deterrent, particularly if they're not allowed quickly into the EU and all of that. So nuclear weapons are going to grow, the question is how.